I'm going to talk about creative disruption. I'm going to talk about creative destruction. I'm going to talk about how we determined that in building our business model we needed to really do something different and at the same time shake up the profession, shake up our industry. And the journey this evening is going to conclude with me explaining to you exactly how we went about doing this and in a sense what our next trick is, which I'm announcing for the camera tonight, but it'll be 3 or 4 months before we actually make our next trick and it presents itself on the internet. But I just wanted for posterity to get it down and let's say to everybody today what it is that we're going to do, so there'll be no surprises later on. So I think what I need to do is kind of just very quickly go through the first 6 parts of the presentation thus far that leads us to where we are today. And hopefully, sort of, you know, if you're here for the first time, as I know 1 or 2 of you are, it sort of sets the scene for what's about to happen. Firstly, I talked about the connection economy, and what I meant by this was that, you know, the world is changing. We move from an industrial era to an era that's based on connections as a result of 24/7 technology. And as a result of connections, we're able to get back to what's really important about life, and that's the relationships that we have with others. So after talking about the connection economy, I explained that if you are in a position to take advantage of a particular expertise that you may have, and of course everybody is an expert in something or particularly good at one thing, but if you have the ability to understand what your expertise is and then parlay that expertise into this machine that is the recipient of all these connections, it's called the internet, then by parlaying that expertise, effectively everybody's got an interest in your subject matter is going to organize themselves around you. And once they organize themselves around you, you have an understanding of what it is that represents the real value that you have in that relationship. And as a result of that, you're able to develop a business and a service proposition around a complete understanding of how your market ticks, because you're selling them what it is that they really need to buy. And because you're trying to persuade people that what you have is of merit, you really got to think about how you can get their attention. And by doing what I've done, which is to build a purple cow in respect of our business and our service model, by definition, the experience that people have with you and your brand and your presence on the internet essentially makes you remarkable. And when you tie into the remarkable nature of your proposition something called an idea virus, which is reflected in Hong Kong Visa for us, it becomes possible for people to propagate essentially your proposition both in an online environment and also in an offline environment. So having dealt with the purple cow piece, I then went on to talk about understanding really at the very, very deepest DNA your marketplace. And I explained that if you can truly put yourself in the position of the party that you wish to have a relationship with and understand what the psycho-emotional dynamics of that relationship are, you can then build a service or a business proposition that makes it essentially seamless or frictionless for people to transact with you. So it becomes vitally important to understand exactly how your market how your market is positioned in relation to what it is that you have on offer, and then deconstruct all the friction points so that when it comes to actually having that relationship with that person, there's nothing getting in the way of progress actually occurring. So that was all about feeling a market. And then I talked about really the old chestnut of internet businesses, which is this thing called SEO, which immediately conjures up people's ideas in people's minds about guys with propellers in their heads. And I explained that actually you can throw all that nonsense out of the window, because if you understand what the search engines are really all about, is they're looking for the best content in your particular niche. And if you can position your content in such a high quality way and use normal language ways to describe what that content is all about, essentially, when people come looking for that material, they will eventually just type in an actual question into the search engine pages, and lo and behold, because your content is structured in a way that it answers questions in a natural fashion, essentially, you get delivered up and people can access your content. But if you continue to do this in your niche, continuously, effectively people who might want to compete with you decide that they're going to cede that ground, and your act of continuing to publish means that over time you map the total knowledge graph in relation to your niche, so that when anybody eventually types in a string of words in English or whatever language it is that you're transacting in, essentially you will always deliver content against that search string, and it will mean that you'll always be at the forefront of people's minds, and so the tribe will continue to build. And so natural SEO is really a function of understanding how people are going to be looking for things in the future, and making sure the content that you develop today not only answers questions and helps people solve their problems, but it also answers to the questions that people are naturally asking to try and access that material. And then last time out, I talked about having a story and explaining that if you want to have a relationship with somebody, essentially you have to empower them to know, so that they can know who you are, warts and all. And I also explained that the reason why stories resonate with us as humans is because intellectually we think about things in a systematic fashion. The way that we conduct our lives involuntarily, it's all a series of events, sequences of little things that we have to do in the way that we live our lives, so that when people recite their stories to us, it resonates with us, we're ready to receive it. And if your story is told in an honest, authentic and transparent fashion, then you remove all the obstacles from people having a relationship with you. So those are the kind of, the 6 constructs of really my business story today. So now I'm going to talk about how we came about disrupting our marketplace. Now, creative disruption is really just a subspecies of creative destruction. And Schumpeter, who is an Austrian-American economist last century, came up with this idea that all industrial economies are in a constant state of flux, that a business or an industry is never standing still because new technologies are always being introduced. And in time, what was a standard way of doing things incrementally ceases to be, and then you have a new standard way of doing things. And that process of ever sort of changing standard processes is really descriptive of creative destruction in an industrial economy. And so we have been going through this process literally since we moved from the agrarian age to where we are today. Certainly things in the last 30 years have sped up because of the internet. But we've effectively arrived at a transition point. And the trick is to understand exactly where we are in that transition point and realize the profound nature of it. And if you do that, if you grasp that nettle, and it's a lesson that I learned 3 or 4 years ago, then you can really build something before anybody else and really steal a march on your competition. So Schumpeter talked about creative destruction, and then a Harvard professor came up with this concept of creative disruption. And while an economy is creatively destructing itself constantly, sort of nested inside that is this sort of act where existing industries or service spaces or areas of economic interest or activity, they are pervading. They have resulted in 1 or 2 really big players that sort of own everything, bar the smaller pieces, either on a geographical basis or on a subspecies of context basis. Essentially, you get a market situation where it's almost impossible to really compete with the big players on their terms. And then Claytonson talks about, he gives examples about the microcomputer industry and also the steel industry. And what he says is this, he says, you know, when there are incumbent players in a particular industry, a market sector, and new players come in and they introduce new technologies, the response of the big market players is to say, well, they're actually going for what is really low margin, low value section of our market. We much prefer to concentrate on the bigger profit, the bigger end of the market. So we'll seed the ground, and we don't have to worry about them. And eventually we might buy them if they become important, but we'll seed the ground. And this notion of creative disruption actually does give you an opportunity to look at any particular marketplace and say to yourself, well, what's that piece of the existing market that I can use my expertise in and go after? And that's what really creative disruption is all about. And once I kind of understood that this was how it all played, I could really start thinking about what was going on in the sort of creatively disruptive world. And the major, for me, the milestone product that represented the pinnacle of creative disruption in the modern era was the iPod. When they could say, 1,000 songs in your pocket. I mean, I come from a generation where, when I was 17 or 18 years of age, the Walkman was all the rage, and I can assure you that was a breakthrough product. That was astonishing. But it was a tape, right? You can only carry so many tapes with you. And then we moved to these spinning disc things, which were marginally better. And then we got to, you know, the idea of MP3s and small MP3 players and what have you. But finally, Apple came up and said, well, what is this proposition? This proposition is 1,000 songs in your pocket. And that then essentially changed the way that music was going to be distributed forever. And then in the more modern era, we're starting to see companies that have kind of cracked this nut. They've gone for really big market spaces, and they've decided that they can creatively disrupt because they've got access to the resources, they understand how the technology can be worked, and essentially these things are just going to plug into that machine called the internet, and they will have a dominant market position. And you know, and the obvious examples are the one that I cite here that everybody's familiar with. But I'm really grateful to Thomas Fine, because he says this, and I'll read it, okay? The distinction, the one that people constantly miss, is that real disruption is almost impossible to see until it's too late. Because the technology of business is so different from what already exists. Now that's brilliant, because it means that you can look at any market space and you can say, do I know that market space well enough to anticipate what the future might look like? And then come up with something that is so left field that by the time I've delivered on that, the proposition is so compelling, people are going to want to do it this way. They're not going to want to do it the old way. And as he says, Thomas Fine says, it's not usually some spectacular new technique. It's often a small and underpowered alternative. And that's what makes it so dangerous and fascinating. I was almost broke 4 years ago. And this is an amazing result for me. I didn't understand what it was going to lead to. But as you'll see, we've arrived at a point now where, you know, the kind of excitement that exists in really big companies like these, we're very small, right? But we've got the same buzz about us because we know things are just changing.